Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 56 of the Feeling Good podcast. And this is our third installment in the Interpersonal Model series. And last time, David, you talked about the three principles that this is based upon. People are probably wondering, so now what do we do? And today we're going to approach the agenda setting part of interpersonal therapy, relationship therapy. Perhaps before we start, you could remind us what the three principles were.
Right, and even before I do that, if there are listeners, mainly therapists, but occasionally the general public sneaks into my workshops, so just a reminder.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
That I've got coming up in a few weeks, the And It's All Your Fault workshop, 2-day workshop on exactly what we're talking about in this Feeling Good podcast series, transforming troubled relationships into loving ones. And I'll be giving it in 3 East Coast cities in 1 week, 3 2-day workshops. October 30 and 31st, 2017, I'll be in Raleigh, North Carolina. November 1 and 2, 2017, I'll be in Atlanta, Georgia again. And November 3 and 4, 2017, I'll be returning to Denver, Colorado. And so if you think you might have an interest in attending one of those 2-day workshops, you can go to my website, the workshop tab at feelinggood.com, and you'll find them with the link to the registration information. Another thing you can do is call IAHB by phone.
Does anyone use the phone anymore?
800-258-8411. That's 800-258-8411. One last point. The first of those 3, the one in Raleigh on October 30 and 31st, will include a live webcast. So if you want to attend this workshop but can't go to one of those 3 cities, you can attend the first one from home.
Yeah, and I think since those workshops will come right on the heels of this series on the interpersonal model, some people may have their interest piqued and may want to attend. And so it's a good thing that the rally will be webcast. So
yes. And I would also say that this workshop will exist on 2 levels. One level is to teach therapists how to help both individuals and couples with troubled relationships using this new model that I've developed with the help of many talented colleagues at my Stanford weekly training group. Also, you'll be working on one of your own personal relationship problems at the same time, so you'll be both the therapist and the patient. Because I think you absolutely have to have the patient experience to appreciate the powerful role of resistance and the importance of the death of the ego, the spiritual dimension of all of this, if you really want to get close to somebody that you've been at odds with.
Any other workshops coming up?
Well, there's a lot more after that. You can find them on my website. I've got 5.
You mentioned them
I've got 5
time,
presentations at the Evolution Psychotherapy Conference in December. I'm going to do 2 with my brilliant colleague who was featured on a recent webcast, Jill Levitt. We're going to do 2 at the ABCT convention in San Diego in November, a 6-hour and a 3-hour workshop, and that'll be a real chance for you to see Jill and me working together. We've got great chemistry, and she's just a beautiful person, a brilliant teacher, a brilliant therapist.
She was your co-therapist in the live session with Mark.
Yeah, and wow, that was a fantastic experience. And And then I'll be up in Calgary, Canada also, Monday, November 27th, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'll be doing 3 presentations there in one day on a large trauma workshop, and I'll be illustrating these high-speed single-session treatment for patients with severe trauma.
Yeah.
And then also one more, if you really want to hear them all, there will be the following day on November 30th, I'll be in Medicine Hat, Canada, doing my one-day Scared Stiff Anxiety Disorders workshop. So there's a lot of stuff coming up, and I hope you can join me at one of those programs.
All right. Well, wonderful. So back to my question now, if you could remind our listeners of those 3 principles that were talked about last week.
The first principle is that we create the very problems in our relationships that we're complaining about. But we don't realize that, so we feel like victims of the other person's badness, and we go about blaming them in our mind and being entirely convinced that the problem is the other person's fault. And that's partly because we're always looking at the other person with our eyes. We can't see ourselves with our eyes very well.
Yeah.
And so we notice all the things the other person's doing wrong, but we're not looking at ourselves to see what we might be doing that provokes that other person and triggers the conflict, fuels the conflict, really. The second principle is the one that really condemns human nature to a certain extent, and that's that we want to do our dirty work in the dark. In other words, our dirty work is the things that we're doing to provoke these problems, loneliness, anger, arguing, escalation of conflicts. We're provoking those things in most cases, but we don't want to look at our role. And if anyone tries to get us to look at our role, to see what we're doing, how we're contributing to the conflict, we will angrily reject that person. Our minds are not open to looking at what we're doing. And if we were willing to look at our role, there would be some hope for the human race. There would be some salvation possible. Mm-hmm. But in most cases, people don't want to see it. We want to cling to this victim role of blaming the other person and kind of feeling morally superior and wanting to get back at that person or get revenge on that person or some such motive.
Right.
And then the third principle is the optimistic and positive one, the hopeful principle, and that's that we have vastly more power than we think to transform a troubled relationship, and often with incredible speed. And I'm talking in a matter of like a minute in many cases to transform a relationship that's been hostile and horrific for years or decades, that we have the power to do that. But there's a heavy price to be paid, and that's that we have to give up blaming the other person and pinpoint our own role in the problem and focus all of our energies on changing ourselves. And in addition, that third step requires the death of the ego, which the Buddhists have called the great death. There's many deaths of the ego, I believe, in Buddhism and in psychotherapy, different aspects of
different egos,
different egos that die in different ways. But this is one of the most painful deaths. On the other hand, if you're willing to die, you'll immediately be resurrected. You'll go to heaven, and so will the person you've been at odds with. And so there is a joyous, fantastic payoff to this model, but there is a stiff price along the way. And those are the 3 principles, and maybe we can talk about how to implement them.
Yes. And I hope that we'll do this in subsequent episodes. So now what do we do? How do we start with this? So somebody comes and says they want help.
Yeah. Well, generally they don't. Generally what you see, at least from the perspective as a therapist, or even, an individual who's talking with someone, generally someone's complaining about somebody. And the biggest therapeutic error of all is to wrongly assume that person does want help, because often nothing could be further from the truth. They want to complain about somebody and they want you to collude with them that that other person is a bum and that they're some kind of victim of the other person's bad behavior, or jerk the other person who is thought of as a jerk. And the attempt to help them is like sticking your fingers in a meat grinder. I'll give a quick story of that, and I'll disguise the identity. But when I was supervising a psychiatric resident, and let me say ahead of time, he has evolved into a psychiatrist of fantastic psychotherapeutic skill and one of the most compassionate and effective therapist, psychiatrist I've ever known. But as a resident, of course, he was learning and making his mistakes. And during one of the supervision sessions, he told me about a patient, a woman who was divorced, and her husband lived in Utah or Arizona or someplace, and had to fly in to see the kids because there was some joint custody kind of things. He had visitation privileges, and so she described picking him up at the San Francisco airport and how they were bickering and arguing, and she was trying to point out to the student therapist, the psychiatric resident, what a loser her husband was, but the resident, we'll just call him Bob to just give him a name, could see that she was communicating with him in a very hostile and adversarial way, and thought that she was asking for help in her this very problematic adversarial relationship she had with her ex. And so Bob, the psychiatric resident, said to her after she'd been talking and complaining about her ex, said something to the effect, I'd be real happy to give you some help with this relationship, and I could show you how to improve the way you communicate with him, and could have a wonderful impact on the way the two of you get along. Yeah. And she absolutely bristled angrily and said, I wasn't asking for help with my communication. I'm an attorney, and I know very well how to communicate. Thank you. And really shot him down like that.
So she said, I'm not asking for help.
Exactly. I don't want help. I just want you to know what a loser I was married to. And actually, what could be better than to have an ex that you can kind of look down on and kick around and complain to friends and people and feel like a morally superior victim. And that's the dynamic that not all people, but most people with troubled relationships find themselves in. And so it's a big error for therapists to jump in and try to help somebody who's talking about their spouse who can't communicate, who can't deal with feelings, who always has to be in control, who always has to be right, who is always being critical. It's a huge mistake, both of therapists and of friends, to try to jump in and help that person, because I'd say 3/4 of the time that they're not looking for help.
Now, in this case, she said the words, I'm not asking for your help. But often it's not that clear-cut. You have people saying, oh, I'm having trouble in this relationship and I don't know what to do. How do you know they're not asking for help?
Well, you want to find out. You want to ask them. Now, of course, we won't go into how to empathize with people with troubled relationships, but that's the first thing that you have to do as a friend or as a therapist. And don't so much argue with them, but to try to buy into what they're saying and provide some emotional support. And you can say things like, "Oh, I know, people can be like that, and I'm sure it's so frustrating to you, and you sound pretty angry and upset, and tell me more about that," and don't at all try to fix or help the person in any way. But at some point, after you've empathized and really seen the world through the other person's eyes, then we do what you've referred to as agenda setting or paradoxical agenda setting, finding out, does the person want help? What do they want help with? And get a specific example of a moment that they were struggling with that relationship, that they would like some help at that moment. So what I often start out by saying is something like, now you've been mentioning your conflict with your sister Sue, and she's been putting you down, and ever since you've been a little girl, and she's jealous of you, and she's critical of you, and everything you've done doesn't work, and you've made it pretty clear that she's like a thorn in the flesh, you might say. You find her very annoying and irritating. Now, I've got some wonderful tools, but I'm not hearing you're asking for help with that relationship, and I just want to make sure that I'm reading you right. Is that right?
And they might just say, "Well, of course I'm asking for help. Why am I here otherwise?"
Oh, I see. So if the person says yes, they are asking for help, then you can say, well, let's see what kind of help you're looking for, and because you've really got three choices when you have a troubled relationship. And if you're a listener and you're thinking about a brother you can't get along with, or a spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend or friend or colleague or whoever, your parent, you can imagine that I'm asking you this next question. And that's that you've got three choices. Number one, when you've got a troubled relationship, you might want to leave that relationship, break up with that person. You might want my help doing that. I'd be very happy to help you with that if that's what you would like. The second choice you would have would be to work to make this relationship better. And that would be a joy to work with you along those lines as well. And I've got some fabulous tools that we could use. And the third choice you would have would be to stay in the relationship and behave in a way that will guarantee that nothing will change, that it will continue to be a miserable relationship. And those are your three choices. What?
They may not need you for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that my experience with people, I'm talking right now, to keep it simple, when you've got an individual with a troubled relationship rather than a couple, the couple becomes more complex, perhaps even more difficult. But just with one person, my experience and the experience of my colleague Jill Levitt, who I teach with at Stanford, and she's in private practice, is that about 3/4 of the time the people will choose the third option. That they are very clear that they absolutely do not want to work on this relationship. They don't want to get out of the relationship. They just want to kind of stay in it and make sure it stays very miserable. They wouldn't say that.
No, exactly. They're not going to say
stay miserable, but to stay in the relationship without changing is a guarantee that the relationship will continue to be miserable.
When you offer the choice to people, well, one choice would be to work to make the relationship better. Wouldn't a lot of people say, "Oh, yes, of course, that's what I would like to do"?
Well, it depends on how you offer it as a therapist. If you're a naive therapist thinking that everyone wants help, you say, "Would you like some help with that?" Everyone will say, "Oh, yes, I really want some help."
So
but then when you go in and try to help them, you run into this wall of resistance. Right. So you've got to be pretty clear about it. And I like to say to the person, I'm not of the school that says you're obligated to get along with everyone, and it sounds like your sister has been very irritating to you, and while it would be a joy to show you how to turn that relationship around, you've told me you've tried everything and nothing works and you're disgusted with her, and if your thinking was that you didn't really want to invest any further energy into making this relationship better or working on it, I would totally understand. And so that's how I would set it up with the person, mm-hmm. kind of give the person permission to tell me they don't really want help with the relationship, because many people, that's where they're really at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as a therapist, you also have to decide that you're not going to condemn people or judge people for that decision either. I mean, sometimes certain people might not be worth the energy, and might be better, to get out of the relationship or to keep that person at a distance. And it's not necessarily smart to try to make every relationship a loving relationship.
Yeah, and of course, I'm also of that school. I think that what I encounter often is people who give lip service to wanting to change.
Yeah,
and
that's
then
right.
in the next breath they say, but he's such a jerk.
Yeah, right. So the change they're looking for is for the other person to change, not for them to change. And that's where you've really got to be pretty clear. It's the same in treating any addiction. If you ask someone, oh, well, do you want some help with your drinking? Oh, yes, doctor, I would like some help. But they don't really want help. What they really want is just to keep drinking because they like drinking. They're committed to drinking or overeating or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the first thing. Now, if the person then can...
And there's a name for this technique. Right?
Interpersonal decision making.
Yes.
And I also have a tool. If the person is really ambivalent, I have a powerful decision making tool. It's too complicated to go into on this podcast, but it can help the person sort out their options. Like one option would be to, stay in the marriage and work on it. And the other option would be, say, to get divorced. And it kind of shows you how you balance these off. I did a decision-making forum with a fellow. I don't know if I've covered this in a previous broadcast, but he was absolutely unhappy with his wife, and we did the advantages and disadvantages. It's a 4-way compartment analysis.
It might be worth presenting at some point with the appropriate handouts. I think people might enjoy that.
It could be. I'm trying to develop a computer program for it, which would be actually far easier for people because the computer could do the math for folks, which is a little bit complicated. But we did this, and the decision to stay in his marriage can go from plus 200 to minus 200. And it was about like minus 110.
Yeah.
And then the decision to get divorced was like about a minus 90. So they were both intensely negative options.
Yeah.
And
damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. And when you come out to where any decision you make is a bad one, it's often because you've got distorted thinking. Like you're looking at the disadvantages of each option, you've got them exaggerated in some way. And so one of the disadvantages of leaving his wife was that he thought his friends would all reject him and hate him.
Yeah.
And so that's why he thought that was a terrible option. And then I had him do an experiment to talk it over with them and see what they thought. And he was surprised that they told him they thought it'd be a good thing if he left her, that they were clearly both really unhappy and that they wouldn't think any less of him. And so then he changed his mind and decided to leave his wife. That became a positive option. But certainly, again, in a case like that, if you were the therapist, tried to help him, communicate more effectively with his wife or relate to her in a more loving way, it would have failed because that's not what he wanted. Yeah.
So do you have a way that we can present today that would help people make that decision?
Well, I think the for where we're at for today's broadcast, I think that's a decision the listener has to make. And let's assume that you're making the decision that you want a better relationship with this person, your brother, your mother, your patient, your customer, your boss, whoever it happens to be. Then the next thing I do is say, who do you think is more to blame for the problems in this relationship?
That's kind of a key question,
Yeah, who do you think is the bigger jerk, you or the other person? And at least 90% of the time, what I get is it's the other person. And listeners, you can ask yourself this question too. Think about the person you're not getting along with and think about all the things they do that irritate you, and they don't listen, and they argue, and they're controlling, they have to be right, et cetera, and you may be...
They leave the toilet seat up.
Exactly. So what I do is I say, take a piece of paper, and we can do it right now as a group exercise, and label the left, put a line down the middle from top to bottom, and then label the left-hand column ADV for advantages, and the right-hand column, DIS, for disadvantages.
And we'll put that on in the show notes, right?
Absolutely. And this is, you can call it a relationship cost-benefit analysis, or if you want to be more precise, call it a blame cost-benefit analysis. Right. And the first thing that I want you to do, and we can actually stop the recording for 5 minutes, or as long as people want. We can just put
they can just pause now, yeah.
And then we'll go over our own list. But we want to start out by saying, what are some of the advantages? What are some of the benefits to you for blaming the other person?
And since you always like to talk in specifics, maybe we can give a hypothetical situation where people would be able to imagine what the advantages and disadvantages would be.
Well,
it could be like a marital situation, and let's say...
Sure. Or it could be your cousin or your brother. We can go for this one in the opposite direction, so it'll apply to everybody, to say, what are some of the advantages of blaming people in general for the problems in your relationships with them? And we can prime the pump a little here and give 1 or 2 examples. Then we'll have a pause, and we'll see if the listeners can come up with at least 10 overpowering advantages of blaming other people.
Yeah.
So what would be some, Fabrice?
Well, I would say that one of the advantages would be that it would give one a sense of superiority. You take the one-up position.
Sure. So I'm going to put moral superiority top on the list, and I think that's. I won't necessarily say it's the most powerful advantage of blaming other people, but I would say that might be the most powerful of all of the advantages. There's probably at least more than 30 completely different advantages, distinct advantages of blaming other people, but that should definitely be up at the top or close to the top of the list. Let's see if we can add one more, then we'll let the listeners see if they can do this. Now, don't do it on paper if you're driving, But if you're not driving, do this on a piece of paper. I think you'll find this very interesting.
I would say another advantage would be that we're off the hook when we're blaming the other person, so we can shirk our own responsibility.
Yes, we're off the hook. There's no responsibility, no guilt, no effort. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, no effort and no need to look at our own foibles. Well, that would be a third one. No need to examine our own behavior, our own foibles. Yeah. So that's enough to get people started. Yeah. And see what you can come up with, and then we'll as soon as you're done, you can turn the recording back on. We'll just have a little brief pause in the recording, and we'll share with you the list that Fabrice and I came up with. All right. Okay, we're back. So I hope our listeners came up with a good list. And during the break, we came up with our own list. Yeah. So we had 2 to begin with. Or 3. We had 3. Moral superiority. Yeah. And if I blame the other person, it keeps me off the hook because I don't have to put in effort. I don't have to feel guilty. I don't have to feel responsible for the problem. And I don't have to examine my own foibles. Yeah. And then during the break, we came up with a number of additional ones. One is revenge. I can kind of stick it to the other person. Yeah, we like that, Yeah, we like getting back. They deserve it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And also in the same tack there, I'd say it gives us an excuse to be aggressive. And there's 2 forms of aggression, active aggression and passive aggression. Yeah. And we all kind of have our choice. Like I prefer being passive aggressive because I can kind of stick it to the other person while being behind their back, while being sweet to them. Yeah, exactly. You look all clean. Yeah, right. Me, I didn't do anything. And I think we are gratified as human beings. I think we do have an instinct toward aggression that is gratified when we can blame somebody. Another one we came up with is truth and righteousness. We can tell ourselves, I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah, I sometimes ask my clients, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And
exactly.
They tend to lean toward right.
Yes, exactly.
They can't let go of that, yeah.
Yeah, and then you can gossip and get support from other people, tell them what a loser so-and-so is, and in most cases people will support you.
Yeah, they'll be empathetic, yeah.
And we were also talking about the fact how people actually do what I call reverse hypnosis, mentioned a number of podcasts back, but will tell their therapist what a loser my spouse is. And they'll even hypnotize the therapist into believing that that person really is a victim, this morally superior victim of the other person's badness. Another huge one we came up with is that the blame will protect my ego and pride.
That's right, because we have to keep that identification with who we are.
Another advantage, as we saw in the story about the woman who was an attorney at odds with her ex, you can argue and keep your distance from the other person. And a lot of us get addicted to arguing. Yeah. And we don't have to then get close to that person.
Yeah.
Another thing is that we can feel powerful and angry.
Anger has a lot of power in it, so we can get addicted to that too.
Absolutely. And then another thing we came up with on our list is that it's real easy to blame other people. So,
yeah, there's an instinctive aspect to that. Like immediately when something goes wrong, we try to point the finger, and it's never back at us.
Absolutely. So that's just the tip of the iceberg on some of the advantages. There are many more, but that can kind of get people started.
Yeah.
Now let's brainstorm. What are some of the disadvantages? What price do we pay for blaming the other person?
Before we get to the disadvantages, wouldn't it be a good time to do paradoxical agenda setting here, and asking the person who's doing the work, after all these advantages, why would they want to change and to stop blaming?
Yes, and you could actually stop this exercise at that point and just leave it at the paradox, and then see if the person can convince you that they want help in spite of that.
And that might be a good time to write down the disadvantages.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing too. Like, what are some of the disadvantages of blaming?
Well, one of the disadvantage is actually being off the hook. I think is a disadvantage because you don't get to grow yourself. Yeah, you get stuck.
Yes, there's no growth. You get stuck, and we could say that there's no growth from at least three perspectives: spiritual, interpersonal. I don't remember what the third one was, but you don't.
You're like Rick Perry.
Huh? Yeah, that's right, Rick Perry, the presidential candidate. Let's see, what is that person who helps the president? Oh yeah, the vice president. What is the United what of America? Oh, states. Yeah. So there's no learning, no forward movement in your life. What are some other disadvantages?
And really, it keeps people feeling miserable because they're constantly at odds with each other. It hides the love if there's any left.
Well, I'd say that counts as two. The first one, that you feel miserable. Yeah. When you're in conflict with someone, it's like this heavy stone you're carrying around all the time. You're working yourself out and you're so angry. And that's robbing you of joy at every minute of every day. And then there's another one that there's no love and no chance for love, because when you blame other people, they're just going to blame you back. It's like hot potato. Yeah. Remember that game as a kid? And nobody is going to say, oh yes, thank you for blaming me. I really am to blame. Instead they're just going to blame you back, and the thing is going to escalate. And so another one I would add, although you feel very powerful when you're blaming the other person, you're actually very impotent and powerless because you have no ability to develop a more loving relationship.
Right, yeah. The feeling of power is actually tricking you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. What are some other disadvantages?
Well, as you say, there's no place to go. We can't move in the relationship. This is really what people come for help with, because they're feeling miserable and they're stuck.
Yeah.
They don't feel loved. They don't feel listened to.
Yeah, that's right. There's no way to get the other person to see your point of view.
Yeah.
Being understood is not possible.
Yeah.
But there are also people may sour when they hear you're complaining all the time.
Yeah.
Also, there could be health downside.
Yes, of course. Anytime we're under some psychological stress, there's
blood pressure. Yeah. People talk about other potential health benefits as well.
So once you have these advantages and disadvantages, then the next step is
then you put two circles at the bottom of the piece of paper, and you read off your list of advantages and disadvantages. Our lists are a little short, and ideally we'd flush them out a little better. But you say the advantages of blaming my brother or my sister, my spouse, whoever it is. I'll feel moral superiority. I won't have any responsibility in the situation. I won't have to feel guilty. I won't have to put out any effort.
And so then do you count how many points you put on each column?
You just say what feels greater to me on a 100-point basis, and it's just an intuitive thing. It's not like counting them up. But is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? Is it 40-60? Which feels greater, all these advantages of blame or all these disadvantages of blame? And I'm going to ask the listeners, just put two numbers on a piece of paper right now at the bottom of those two columns that show how you're feeling. Are the advantages of blame greater or the disadvantages? And we'll just give you 10 seconds to do that, and then I'm going to ask you how they came out.
Yeah. If they've put their disadvantages down on their cost-benefit analysis, yeah.
Yeah. So put up your hands now, if you've done that. Oh, I see most of you have your hands up. So what numbers did you put on your piece of paper? Oh, yours was 40-60. So for you, the disadvantages were greater. That's neat. How many of you say the disadvantages of blame are greater than the advantages? Oh, I see. That's about 3/4 of you, or 80% of you have your hands up. That's cool. And so what we've done now is we've swung most people over from this blaming mindset to saying, I'm willing to give up the blame. Now, how many of you say the advantages of blame are greater? Okay, I see about 20% of you. And then how many of you is it 50-50? Well, there's just a few of you. Now, here's what I do. If the person, and if you listeners have said the advantages of blaming this person I'm not getting along with are greater than the disadvantages, then I simply say, well, I don't know of any tools in all of the world that can help somebody who blames others for the problems in your relationships. And
that's a key thing.
That's the key thing. And so if that's where you stand, I say, God bless you, but perhaps I could help you with something else. I'm not going to be able to help you with this relationship problem. Now, some of you have put 50-50, and I would say...
And what would you say would be the response to somebody to whom you say this?
I can't think of it right off the top of my head. Maybe you can answer that question.
Well, I don't have a good answer. People tend to really think that they can work through this, and they don't have to blame the person that they want to improve their relationship with. And even though they say they don't want to blame, classically, they will come up with some blaming statement afterwards.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I can give you an example. I treated a fellow who had a marital problem, and he said his problem was that his wife was wrong in many things, and she wouldn't listen to him. And he thought that his role should be a teacher, and her role should be kind of like a student, and to listen to his wise advice on how to do all of these, tasks of daily living. And so I did a blame cost-benefit analysis with him, and it came out about 90-10. The advantages of blaming his wife vastly outweighed the disadvantages. It was 90-10, and I said, I wouldn't have any tools to help you. And he said, oh, Dr. Burns, you've got to help me. I mean, he really liked me. He really looked up to me. He thought my book was wonderful, feeling good. And I said, I really like you, and if there's something else you want help with, I'd love to work with you, but I absolutely wouldn't know how to help you develop a loving relationship with your wife as long as you're going to take the position that you're the superior one, and she's at fault, she's to blame. And I think they eventually ended up getting divorced. He did not want to give up the blame. I don't know. Could you provide an answer personally to this question?
Well, I mean that is a good question, because
have you found yourself in this role ever?
Yeah, I have.
And did I tell you I didn't know how to work with you then?
Yes. No, actually, well, I don't remember if that's what you said, but. We did some work.
Yeah.
And it's not always as clear cut as it seems, but it's a little bit hopeless to get to that point. Isn't there a way to work with people who are blaming, maybe to help them recognize that they maybe don't want to continue blaming? I don't know.
I would not want to take that role myself, because that's that codependent role of, kind of trying to help people against their will. As a therapist, your backup position would be just to empathize with the person some more. Maybe you've jumped in too soon to try to help them and they haven't really been heard. You give them another, 30 minutes or a session or two of empathy, and then come back to the agenda setting and say, now you're telling me about how angry you are with your sister, your wife, or whoever, and I'm wondering now, is that something you want help with, or did you mainly just want me to know what a difficult person that is? And then if they continue to say, I'm really don't, want help with the relationship, or I'm not willing to look at my own role in the relationship. See, one is called outcome resistance, and one is called process resistance, and then I just sit with open hands because I just don't see it as my role to make the world conform to my vision of how things should be or how people should be. And I would say this is one of the toughest things, too, for therapists, because often the person who's at odds with their wife or with their husband, when they describe the problem, you, the therapist, may feel rightly that you can see the solution for them. And often that the solution wouldn't be that difficult. And yet, in many cases, the person doesn't want to get close to that person, and that can be hard for the therapist to let go. That requires the death of the therapist's ego, that codependent narcissistic ego that thinks, my self-esteem is based on helping every single patient, whether they want help or not. Yeah. But I think it's disrespectful to try to be helping people against their will, or to say, well, I got to figure out how to get this person to want to get close to his wife or his sister or her boss or whoever. And I don't see that as my role anymore.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit of a pessimistic note, because you're really saying that there's a segment of people there who will not be helped.
Yeah. And it's not because they're hopeless or because fabulous techniques don't exist. Fantastic techniques do exist, and next podcast will show exactly how they work. But it's up to the choice is for the person, would you like healing in this area? Would you like some help? Would you like to change? Would you like to get closer to that person? Would you like greater love in your life? And sadly, often the answer is no.
Well, I can't wait for the next episode then. Well, thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Fabrice.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.